Welcome to Conversations from the Hive, where we explore the emotional side of food allergies. I'm excited to have Dr. Francesca here to help talk with us today. She's a clinical psychologist based in the UK. Dr. Francesca, thank you for making time for this conversation at the end of a long week, especially with our time difference. To start us off, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Of course, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here. So yeah, I am Francesca, and I am a clinical psychologist based in the UK. So just a little bit about that, because I know things are a little bit different in the UK to the States. So training in the UK to be a clinical psychologist means that you do an undergraduate degree and then you go on to do a professional doctorate. Over a number of years, various different clinical placements alongside research. And in the UK, it's the kind of highest level of professional training that you can get within the mental health space. So as clinical psychologists in the UK, we do therapy, we work clinically, we complete research, we're trained very holistically across lots of different therapeutic modalities, and we can really assess people and work out their specific situation and circumstances, and then use the range of different therapy approaches to kind of target what the problem is that we've identified. So I work in the NHS, which is our National Health Service, and I work primarily in pediatrics, so basically child health, and in a like hospital based. And I work with lots of children who have really rare disorders or conditions, metabolic, genetic conditions, neurodevelopmental differences. So a lot of my work is adjustment to kind of living with these medical conditions. And then alongside my clinical work, I also work for a university, and I do teaching and training, and I run my own private practice. And, you know, I guess how the allergies fit in is that I do have a bit of a special interest in allergies. And we'll probably come on to talk about this more, but I previously ran a psychology allergy service within a big hospital here in the UK, which actually runs one of the largest allergy services in Europe. But since leaving there, I still work a lot in that area. Primarily in my private practice, but I also work really closely with allergy charities here in the UK, and alongside some medical doctors, because, you know, for me, I really believe that allergy care needs that kind of holistic, joined up input from like multiple professionals. So yeah, that's me.
You are busy.
Yes, I do feel busy a lot of the time.
And where can you practice? Can you practice throughout the UK or only England?
I can practice all over the UK.
Okay.
Yeah, so I can practice like nationally within the UK. I would say like, well, probably like the rest of the world, pre-COVID, that would have been, you know, very much face to face within the hospitals, within the kind of area, as in location where you were based. But, you know, definitely since COVID, I am connecting with people all over the UK, because it's suddenly made it, you know, much more accessible and much more, you know, reasonable to kind of work with that. And I think that is probably one of the benefits, you know, that has come out of COVID, you know, being able to reach more people, especially within a field like allergy, where, you know, there maybe isn't that input everywhere.
Was there something specific about allergies that made you want to continue to specialize in it?
Yes, definitely. So, yeah, as you would have heard, I've had quite a varied career. But I think when I was given the opportunity to work in allergy, I mean, the story about how that came about is quite random, so I might save that for another time. But when I actually started in that role, I didn't have any experience of working in allergies. But what I did have was lots of other experiences, which was how I got the role actually. And I maybe didn't see it as relevant at the time, but I've got a lot of experience with autism and the kind of more sensory aspect of food. I'd got a lot of experience with feeding, eating disorders, like adjustment to health conditions and anxiety, both personally and professionally. And I think from the moment I started that role, I just loved it. I met so many fantastic families. And I think I just really saw how much psychology was needed in that area. And I think because I'd not heard of an allergy psychologist before,
Mm-hmm.
I was coming from that position. Like I understood how it was hidden. I completely understood why people wouldn't have heard of it because I was that person.
Mm-hmm.
But having realized how much it was needed, it just made me really passionate about the importance of making it visible and raising awareness and finding a way to do that. And then I think the other thing that made me so passionate about kind of continuing in the area was that I was hearing the same stories over and over again. And these were like the first time that families had shared these things with me. And for them, it was like, oh, am I the only person that's feeling this? They'd never heard of anybody or never connected with anybody that had heard that. And, again, that just highlighted to me, the real need to just show people that they weren't alone with that. So, yeah, I think that's why I've continued to carry on working in the area and why I'm so kind of keen to do so.
That's great. And can you help us understand more generally what the landscape looks like in the UK in terms of mental health therapy and emotional support for food allergies? Because it sounds like there's not a lot. Like, and you're one of the very few food allergy psychologists that is there practicing.
Yeah. There's not a lot of psychologists specialised in allergies, that's for sure. So in terms of the landscape, so in the UK we have a national health service, and psychological therapy more generally is something that is offered on our national health service for free for those that need it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's across the whole spectrum, really. We have lots of specialist services, probably for most things: psychosis, addiction, eating disorders, brain injury, older adults, memory, children, across the whole lifespan, like you name it, it's probably there in some capacity. And we have designated mental health services for that. And we also have our physical health services where, it's becoming more common for psychologists to be embedded in those as well. So things like, intensive care, where I've worked previously, cardiac, respiratory, yeah, you name it, endocrine, dermatology, so psychology is really starting to become embedded. However, for allergy, it's just nowhere near, in my opinion, where it needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are probably a number of reasons for that. First and foremost, funding is the main one. And, again, it's quite complex and not often that clear how funding gets allocated. But, I think funding is based on a number of things. And, first, we need to have awareness that it's an issue in the first place. I think we need to show that level of demand, that it's needed. And we also need to be showing that treatments work and are effective. So it kind of produces this economic argument for funding. So in the UK, I think that's really where we're at the moment. We're starting to raise that awareness. We've got some psychologists that are now starting to pop up in very small amounts, but kind of pop up in services, whether that's be that they've got some specific funding or there's been a charity that might have funded a psychologist for a short while. There's these little projects, these little pockets that are coming up. So we're showing that there's demand. We're definitely showing that. And, there's lots of exciting research showing the impact psychologically having allergies can have. And, we're now moving towards showing that therapy can be really effective as well. We've got lots of charities in the UK that are really kind of lobbying and campaigning more at a policy level. So I think we're making headway, but it's slow. Um, so yeah, I don't know how that fares in the USA.
I think it's quite different. I mean, the things that are the same are we have quite a bit of demand and not enough allergy informed therapists.
Yeah,
Maybe one thing that's a little bit different is I think most of the allergy therapists or psychologists here came to it from a personal connection where they had a child with food allergies and they were a mental health therapist or a psychologist.
yeah,
So they start specializing in that. That seems to be, what's happening. Or they're a person an adult that has their own allergies. So there's this
yeah,
personal connection.
yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely a way that lots of professionals probably come into working in allergy in the UK as well. I think there's also um, because, I mean, again, we're trying to change it, but teaching specifically on allergy isn't like a standard as part of
Right.
training. So, not only is there not that awareness, I think that, we've got so many, loads of very skilled clinical psychologists in the UK. As I said, it's like the highest level of training you can get. But I think the confidence that would I be able to work with allergies, because it is very niche, it is very specialist, it
Right.
does come with things that do need thinking about in a very different way. So, I think there's some work to be done there in terms of bridging that gap and,
Mm-hmm.
building the skill set even within our professional workforce here.
Yeah, definitely. Same here. Same here.
Yeah.
So you have a new ebook that's just come out titled Managing Guilt When Your Child Has Allergies. And I'd love to dive into that with you. And to start us off, why is it important to address parental guilt when it comes to food allergies?
Mm. Well, and you will know this very well, but having a child with allergies is hard enough. It comes with such a big emotional burden, and I often call it with my clients, it's like this invisible load of all of that extra allergy admin, appointments, medication, label reading,
Yeah.
planning, that kind of, you're always thinking you don't really get a break from that switching off. And I think if we add on top of that the weight of guilt and we put that into the mix, that's before you've even started just with general parenting and just having a child. So you're just starting from this much higher load. Like there's not much capacity left there. And then, all of the other things that could go wrong, your threshold for that is just so much lower. So I think it's really important that we're kind of proactive in doing that, like trying to reduce that threshold before we've even started, because otherwise you're just, you're not on a level playing field, really. And we know that guilt does hold a particular heaviness, a particular weight that can really, in my experience, feed through to the core of how somebody feels about themselves. So their self-confidence, their self-esteem, their sense of whether they're a good enough person. If this continues, that's how guilt can start feeding through. And, I've seen how that is, if that's left untreated, unsupported, not addressed, it starts to eat away, it starts to fuel more guilt, it starts to almost become the lens by which everything is interpreted, start to see the world in a more negative way. It can kind of sap enjoyment from things. And, we know, and the research does show, the small amount of research that is there, that the longer this goes on, the more detrimental impact that's having on mental health. And not only that, then that's how that feeds through to the child's mental health. Not that that's intentional or direct, but,
Right.
children do pick up on things. They pick up on anxiety. They start mirroring little ways of talking about themselves, and I'm really pro children growing up with really positive allergy identity and kind of really owning that and not seeing that as a burden. So, though I think that the earlier that we can address parental guilt, we are, proactively managing a lot of these things that we know or that I see become a problem later on. So for me, that's why it's like really important to address it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I can tell from this conversation and from your ebook, which I really enjoyed, that we were trained in similar ways, and we probably practice certain models of therapy. Because one of the things I do in my work, whether it's therapy or in the food allergy hive, is really talk about emotions and, that they are not good or bad. And, they're data points and they have a job and a function. And part of the work of emotional awareness and regulation skills is like learning what that is and then how to address it. And you talk about that in your book. You say guilt has an important function and a job to do. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. And I think, I guess just to start, we sometimes forget that, right? I think we sometimes forget that emotions have a function, and we have got into these quite unhelpful ways of thinking, oh, that's good, that's bad. But, we do feel emotion for a reason, and often a really important reason. If we feel anger when somebody or something has conflicted with our values or our ethics, it's kind of giving us an important little cue as to, what might be going on. We feel sad when we're in pain, or if somebody's hurt us, or if something's distressing us. Again, it's giving us quite a valuable cue as to what might be going on and what we might need to address. And guilt is really no different to that, in my opinion. I think we sometimes use guilt and shame interchangeably, which I don't probably need to get into too much, but guilt for me, or guilt, as the research would suggest, is more about an action or a behavior. So like that I have done something wrong, whereas shame is more as a like whole person, like I am bad, or I have not done something. But with guilt, the function of that really is meant to be if we've done something wrong, or we've acted in a manner that's out of character, or we've done something that's not in line with our values or our ethics. And that might be intentional, quite often it's unintentional, but its function really is social. We're social beings. If we have unintendedly or accidentally offended someone or upset someone, it prompts us to make amends, to apologize, to reach out, to take action, to kind of repair that. It allows us to hold insight into other people and how our actions impact other people. So, it is actually a really important thing that we feel this. But, and it is a big but, I think that that's the function of guilt at a basic level, evolutionary level. We are complex as humans. Guilt is a complex emotion, and it is impacted by a lot of other things. Personal experience, upbringing, attachment is a big one. People pleasing disposition, how we think about it. It's probably, again, much more complex than what I want to get into now. But there is a point to this. I think the important thing that we need to know about guilt is that it can be an unjustified guilt. It can develop into an unjustified guilt. So that is that we start taking responsibility for things that are not our fault, or when we haven't done something wrong. And for me, this is the bit that I see so often in allergies, that parents hold a lot of blame or a lot of guilt for their child's allergies and all the associated things that might come with that, or they might see their child as missing out on. And I think because parents can't make amends, there's nothing they can do about that. This then becomes this vicious cycle, because there's nothing they can do, but they're almost like trying to make it better, but they're not making it better. And then they feel bad that they're not feeling better, and then like they're not good enough because they're not making it better. And we just get trapped in what I see as this cycle of, getting trapped into this cycle of guilt, and it just perpetuating rather than actually addressing the guilt and was it justified in the first place.
Right. So how does this unjust kind of this sense of maybe inappropriate responsibility or self-blame on the part of parents, you talked about how it can become a way of finding certainty around the child's allergies when there's so much uncertainty, in terms of like the whys. Why did this happen? Why us? Why now? All of that.
Yeah, and I have spoken quite a lot about this on my socials, because that's a question kind of I often get asked is, but like, why do we feel this essentially?
Mm-hmm.
And, there isn't lots of research into it, but, lots of my hypothesis and kind of how I often make sense of it with parents is if you receive an allergy diagnosis, like often the first question is like, why?
Mm-hmm.
Why has this happened? How did this happen? And, although we have science and research for allergies, most of the time, actually, despite all that science and that research and, all of this kind of, medical development, we don't actually know the answer. It's certainly not a straightforward one. And there are lots of uncertainties, as you all know. There's lots of unknowns, and there's usually not really a specific reason or a specific thing that we can pinpoint it on. But our brains like certainty. As humans, we like certainty. And if we have that certainty, it's like we know what to do. It becomes that roadmap, well, it's this, so we do this. But if we don't have it, there isn't an obvious answer. And I think this is almost where the brain fills in the gaps, and it jumps up with it jumps to conclusions, or it starts to very subtly start to put in these narratives, which, are not the truth, but there isn't a truth. But it's kind of trying to make sense of that. And, we do know across all aspects of psychology, and, particularly stuff like the research that went into all of eyewitness testimony, just shows us how unreliable human memory is and just how easy it can be manipulated. And, people can see something, their own eyes, but literally just being asked questions in particular ways, or differences in mood can completely change their interpretation of what happened. So, it's so easy to just come up with these, these ideas. And I think that, coming back to your question, that self-blame, again, it's very subtle, and I think it happens over time, but it almost becomes that certain explanation. It becomes the more, even though it's uncomfortable, it becomes more comfortable than sitting with this idea of unknown. So yeah, and that's what I see. I see parents blame themselves, and I think especially if they feel like there was something they might have missed or could have, with hindsight, done differently. That's where it comes in. But that's the thing. All of this stuff, and this is what I say all the time, and you've known this from my book, is that you don't know what you didn't know at the time, and you didn't have any of that information. And I think we often look back at something or look back at a decision, and question that. But what I always say to somebody is we're looking back at that with knowledge that we didn't have at that time. We're basing that decision on a now, which is a completely different situation to what we're in, and that's just that's really unfair, because we're coming up with all sorts of conclusions that we just could not have known. And again, that spirals in terms of negative thoughts, looking for evidence, and we find evidence. We know that if we're looking for something, we'll find the little bits, we'll find that one piece of negative feedback amongst the whole load of good feedback. And all of this just reinforces that self-blame. And I've spoken about that before. If that's left untreated or unchallenged, then it's just going to perpetuate that self-blame, and then that's when that's going to become more entrenched, and then that's going to impact on self-esteem.
I love that you're bringing attention and awareness to this, and I think it highlights the importance of bringing self-compassion to that part of ourselves that so dislikes uncertainty that we would rather commit to and believe something that is hurtful and maybe even doesn't help us, it doesn't serve us and our values and our goals, but we like the certainty of a certain narrative over the uncertainty of I don't know, and I'll probably never know, and how hard that is to just tolerate that.
Tolerating uncertainty is
hard.
It's hard, but it's the big thing we need to aim for, isn't it? But it's so hard, because I just don't think our brains were designed to sit in an uncertain place.
No. And I've certainly seen this as a food allergy therapist here in the United States. You talk about kind of a common difficulty letting go of guilt once it's done its
Mm,
job.
yeah.
Whether it's justified or unjustified, once it's kind of served its purpose and it's done its job, some people just want to hold on to it. And we're talking about some of the reasons just now in terms of, that drive for certainty and things like that. But what else are some of the other reasons why maybe parents have a hard time, or other people, they don't have to be parents, they could just be normal adults, but have a
Yeah.
hard time letting go of guilt?
Yeah. Um, yeah, and it's a really interesting question as well. And it is part of that. The reason I had to put it into the book is because guilt is so powerful. It is people come wanting guilt to go away. But then often what I was finding is when we were kind of trying to delve into this, there was actually these barriers that are kind of stopping that.
Mm-hmm.
So that work does have to be done first. And I think it often surprises people, but I think people surprise themselves with what kind of comes up. So yeah, some of the barriers, and obviously they're very personal to every individual, but it's not having an explanation. Um, I think sometimes parents feeling like they need to suffer because their child is, and I'm not saying that that's on a fully conscious level, but if you're seeing a child suffer, you're so connected as a parent. I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you take a lot of that on as well, even if that's unconsciously. I think that another big one that I see as well is believing the guilt is almost the thing that's allowing them to keep fighting, keep pushing, keep
Right.
making things better for their child. There's almost a fear of like, what if I don't have that? Will
Mm-hmm.
I be a good enough
Mm-hmm.
parent? Will I keep fighting? And that's very similar for anxiety as well. But worry as well. I think that's a big block that people have in letting go of worry. They don't want to worry, but
Mm-hmm.
they worry that if they don't worry, they
Right.
they won't be able to kind of keep doing stuff. Um, yeah, and we've kind of touched on this already, but I think as awful as guilt can feel, it is also what becomes familiar.
Mm-hmm.
It's the journey of letting go of that is quite difficult because it does feel so familiar. And I think it can be so hard when you start addressing guilt and you've suddenly got this very different feeling. It's very easier to fall back into familiar habits. And I'm sure you'll see this as well with anxiety, especially like the high functioning anxiety. And often people are so used to being in this really high pressured, stressful situation that is, in many respects causing them quite a lot of harm and quite a lot of difficulties. But almost for that first period of time working where we're like pulling the brakes right off, we're slowing that stress response right down. It's almost like there's no stimulation there. So, I think learning to sit with these new feelings that might come
Mm-hmm.
up when we let go of a particular feeling is also something that
Mm-hmm.
we, have to discuss and address
Mm-hmm.
too.
Right. And this kind of intersects with what we were just talking about in terms of not really liking the unknown or uncertainty. And when you get adapted to a certain way of thinking and seeing the world, letting go of that to embrace something new can just be scary and overwhelming for
Yeah,
people.
definitely. So I think and again, this is what I speak about in my book. But for me, that first stage, which is why it's so important that we like question whether there's any obstacles, is like almost giving parents permission to allow themselves to do this. Because I think that's the other thing about
Mm-hmm.
guilt. The nature of guilt is blaming you like you're undeserving to do some
Mm-hmm.
of this. Not for everybody, but I think it's important to just think about because that giving permission
Mm-hmm.
is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of this relates in certain ways to some concepts that you talk about: good enough parenting, safe enough.
Mhm.
I think, these ideas of, they're almost like anti perfectionistic ways of looking at the world and thinking about things. Can you tell us what you mean by good enough and safe enough and how you
Yeah,
use them with clients?
sure. Um, so, good enough, as you'll know, comes from the work of Donald Winnicott.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's quite old kind of theories now, but it's been hugely influential in terms of how we understand attachment and parenting. So good enough is this idea that a mother or any parent caregiver essentially needs to fail their child. I know it sounds a bit mad, doesn't it? But they need to not be able to meet all of their child's needs all of the time. And that, this idea of failing a child or not always getting it right is essential for development. If we were to wrap children up in cotton wool, so to speak, and meet all of their needs, don't let them experience any sort of distress, get everything right, feed them when they're hungry, on everything, all of the time. I mean, not only is that hugely impossible, but it sets up expectations, for that child that everything's just going to be great for me. I'm never going to have to worry about anything. They don't have to tolerate any sort of distress. They don't learn to self-soothe because somebody's doing it for them. And, I think most importantly, don't learn to problem solve when something goes wrong, which is essential for, children actually being safe in the world. So, that idea that almost being perfect in your parenting is, detrimental to the child. And, I think there's lots of research coming out now that's even showing us that we only actually need to meet children's needs or get it right 30% of the time, which shocks people when I say that. But, that's what the research is showing. And, if we can meet it 30% of the time, then that can still lead to, very healthy attachments. So, good enough is about this idea of creating an attachment which is safe enough for a child to explore the world, and kind of go off, but that when tricky things happen, that a parent is going to guide and support them, and kind of learning this idea that failure is a part of life. So that's good enough. Safe enough is a term that I have kind of given and I use actually more in relation to allergy anxiety, but yeah, I guess is something that I think that when you're living with allergies, this idea of safe enough is a concept that I'm really keen for people to adopt quite quickly. So it's similar in the sense of good enough, in that it's acknowledging that we can't be perfect. But safe enough is also about acknowledging that living with allergies, there's always a level of risk. And I know when I first started working the field, even saying that out loud felt uncomfortable. People felt uncomfortable hearing it, sitting with it. But, it is the reality that there is a level of risk. And that is no different from being human. That's no different from crossing the road, getting in your car, getting on a plane, participating in sport. Basically everything we do, there is a level of risk. But there is also so much that we can do to minimize that risk. So much at, many levels. And, we can minimize risk and we can live happy, healthy lives with allergies. So safe enough is basically was this kind of idea that there's a level of risk, but we can live safely with it by minimizing it. But it's an important differentiation because it allows us to sit with that uncertainty that we've spoken about so much. If we don't acknowledge safe enough and that there's a level of risk, what happens is, that uncertainty, that bit that's uncertain, that's what drives worry, rumination, what if this, what if that drives the control on this hamster wheel of trying to fit that uncertainty, control that uncertainty. And it just results in this never ending battle that's never going to be won. And so, I think if we can shift the focus away from that much more into minimizing risk, setting the standard at safe enough, I found that ironically that reduces anxiety more than they're trying to get control.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also opens up space both for the parent and for the child to have to experience some of those uncomfortable emotions and learn skills for how to regulate them. Whereas if we are always doing things perfectly and protecting them from, not only the kind of the negative things that could happen with allergies, but also the hard emotions, then we're never giving our kids chance to practice skills and learn how to feel those feelings and regulate them.
Exactly. 100% agree with that.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, are there any last words of wisdom or tips for those who are struggling with guilt around their food allergies that you would love to share?
What did I say? So I think the key take-home message that I would like anybody who's listening to this or struggling with this would be to know that it doesn't have to be that way. I'm not saying that it's easy, and I'm not saying that it's, super straightforward, but it certainly doesn't have to be that way. So talk to somebody, anybody, kind of start sharing this and talking about it. As we've spoken a little bit about compassion, but be kind to yourself. Compassion is a huge part of managing guilt. It's a huge section in my book as well. So start with those kind words to yourself. Take small steps. I think we often underestimate that. We want to kind of go in with big changes, but take those small steps. So yeah, and if you do need any further help, do consider downloading my ebook. It's not therapy, but I think that it's probably one of the closest things you will get without paying for therapy. And it's full of every strategy and every technique I've ever used with people. So and the whole reason I created this was to make something that was super accessible and super affordable for as many people as possible who might be struggling with this.
And let me echo that, because it's great. It's short. I think it's about 60 pages, and it's really easy to read and walk through. It kind of covers 7 steps in terms of managing guilt. And there's worksheets and there's prompts and exercises people can go through. So it is a wonderful resource out there. Where can people find it?
So you can if you can first follow me on Instagram, because that's where I kind of post kind of links to it. But yeah, so if you can either check out my Instagram or my website, and then you'll find links on how to download it.
Okay. And what is your Instagram handle and what's your website?
That's a very good question. So my Instagram handle is
It's the toughest question today.
I know. How is that the hardest question? My Instagram handle is at Dr. Francesca S. And my website is the same, drfrancescas.co.uk.
Okay. And if people want to try to see you in real life for therapy in the UK, can they go to that website to contact you?
Absolutely.
Well, we're going to include links and resources in the show notes for everything we just talked about. I want to thank you again, Dr. Francesca, for this conversation and for bringing attention to the very real and very important topic of managing guilt around allergies. It's one of those things I hear about almost daily from people. And, it's right up there probably with anxiety and trauma around allergic reactions that people struggle with. So thank you for creating the ebook, for talking with us today. And it was really a delight to talk with you.
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.